On a freezing night outside Timberline Falls, Gareth Vale saw a German shepherd chained beside an abandoned pumping station. The dog did not beg for help. It simply walked toward the dark facility, stopped, and looked back. Inside, Gareth found an injured young technician named Mason Kerr, carrying a surname he had spent nearly 20 years trying not to remember. Mason was the son of Daniel Kerr, Gareth's fallen SEAL teammate, and he had no idea who Gareth was. What began as a rescue soon reopened an old wound, while Ranger kept returning to a pipeline tied to warnings no one had taken seriously. Before the storm was over, Gareth would learn that honoring the dead was not the same as punishing the living. Tell us where you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers and keep these stories coming. By the time Gareth Vale left Timberline Falls, the snow had erased most of the road behind him. It came down in broad, dry sheets, sweeping sideways across the highway and gathering in pale ridges along the shoulders. The beams of Gareth's pickup cut through only a narrow tunnel of white before the darkness swallowed everything again. He drove with both hands on the wheel. Not because the road frightened him, because habits stayed long after reasons disappeared. The heater pushed warm air against his boots, carrying the faint smell of canvas, old leather, and the hardware supplies stacked behind the passenger seat. A coil of wire, 2 propane fittings, a box of roofing screws, coffee he had forgotten to drink hours ago. Nothing unusual. Nothing that required remembering anything. That was how Gareth preferred most days now. At 52, he had built a life around small, necessary things. Splitting wood, fixing frozen pipes, clear of snow from the narrow path to his cabin. Driving into Timberline Falls only when the list on the kitchen counter became too long to ignore. His appearance still carried traces of a different life, although Gareth no longer thought of it that way. He was tall, a little over 6 feet, with a lean, hardened build that had resisted age better than comfort ever had. His shoulders remained broad under a charcoal canvas jacket, and beneath it he wore the same kind of olive-drab combat shirt he had trusted for years, close through the torso, camouflage sleeves marked by faded horizontal bands around the upper arms. His hair had gone salt and pepper at the temples and was cut short without military precision. A thin layer of stubble shadowed his long, angular face. The field watch on his left wrist had a scratched crystal. Gareth had replaced the strap twice. He had never replaced the watch. The highway curved north. Ahead, through the snow, a cluster of skeletal metal structures appeared beside the road. Pumping Station 6. Gareth knew the place mostly as a landmark. Turn left at the rusted access sign, continue 6 miles, cross the cattle grid, and the road eventually narrowed toward his cabin. The pumping station itself had been inactive since early autumn. Timberline Gas had shut the site after consolidating operations farther east. Since then, snow had begun reclaiming the yard. Tonight, the place looked almost sunken into the storm. Gareth drove past the first gate. Then, something moved near the fence. His foot came off the accelerator. For half a second, he assumed it was a coyote. Then the shape lifted its head. A dog. A German shepherd stood close to the chain-link fence, snow gathering across the dark saddle of its back. Gareth slowed. The dog did not run toward the truck. It simply watched. That bothered him more. He drove another 40 yards before stopping. For several seconds, Gareth stared through the rearview mirror. The animal remained exactly where it had been. Damn it! He shifted into reverse. The pickup rolled backward until the dog appeared beside the passenger side window. Up close, Gareth could see that the shepherd was male and full-grown, large through the chest but not heavy. Thick, black and tan fur insulated him well against the cold. The right ear stood straight, the tip of the left angled slightly outward. The dog was not starving, not feral either. A brown leather collar circled his neck. Something hung from it, Gareth lowered the window 2 inches. The German shepherd turned his head toward the sound. "You lost?" The question felt stupid as soon as Gareth said it. The dog stepped away from the road, then stopped, turned, looked directly at Gareth. Snow hissed across the pavement between them. The shepherd walked toward the service gate, stopped again, looked back. Gareth remained still. The dog repeated the movement, 3 steps, a pause, a look. There was no excitement in it, no frantic barking, no helpless circling. It looked deliberate. Gareth shut off the engine. The cold rushed in the moment he opened the door. His boots sank ankle-deep beside the road. "Fine," he muttered. The shepherd was already moving toward the gate. Gareth followed. That was when he noticed the chain. A broken length of steel links hung from the dog's collar, perhaps 18 inches long. The final link had been twisted open. Gareth crouched slightly, though he kept his distance. The dog watched without retreating. A metal tag knocked against the collar. Ranger. Ranger. One ear shifted at the name. So it was his. Gareth looked at the broken chain. He could imagine a dozen ordinary explanations. Someone had tied the dog outside and forgotten him. The animal had broken loose from a nearby property. A trucker had stopped and lost control of him. But Ranger had no interest in leaving. The dog turned toward the pumping station again, and waited. Gareth felt something old and unwanted move in his chest. Recognition. Not of the dog, of behavior. A request without noise. He had seen that kind of insistence before, in men who had no breath left to waste. Gareth straightened. "All right." Ranger moved. The service gate had been secured with a chain, but one side of the fence had pulled away from a post where snow and wind had weakened the ground. Ranger slipped through. Gareth followed with more difficulty, catching his jacket once on the wire. Inside, pumping station 6 was almost silent. Wind slid between steel towers and dormant pipework with a low mechanical moan. Frost covered valve wheels. Snow lay untouched across most of the yard. Ranger kept to a narrow path beside the main structure. Gareth noticed paw prints. Several sets, some older, some fresh. He also saw boot prints. That changed everything. "Hey!" His voice carried across the station. No answer. Ranger continued toward the rear of the property. Gareth's pace quickened. The shepherd led him behind the main compressor shed, past a row of storage drums and a frozen drainage trench. At the far edge of the yard stood a small maintenance building Gareth had barely noticed from the highway. Its door was partly open. Ranger reached it and stopped. This time the dog did not look back. He lowered his head and gave one sharp bark. Gareth's body reacted before his thoughts did. His shoulders tightened. His breathing changed. He reached for the flashlight clipped beneath his jacket and stepped inside. The air smelled of cold steel, old grease, and damp insulation. "Anybody in here?" A sound answered, not words, a rough exhale. Gareth swept the flashlight across shelving, tool cabinets, a workbench, then downward. A section of metal flooring near the back wall had collapsed. A young man was trapped waist-deep in the opening. One leg had fallen through while the other was twisted awkwardly above the floor. His face was pale from cold and pain. "Don't move," Gareth said. The young man gave a strained laugh. "Wasn't planning on it." That was a good sign. Sarcasm meant air. Gareth crouched beside the brake. The man looked to be in his mid-20s, lean, dark-haired, work jacket zipped to the throat. One eyebrow bore a small scar. A portable inspection light lay broken near his left hand. "How long?" "Maybe an hour." "You hit your head?" "No." "Feel your toes?" The man hesitated. "Some." Gareth's eyes dropped to the damaged floor. The metal was badly corroded along the edge. not a clean break. It had peeled downward under weight. Ranger stood 3 feet away, perfectly still. Gareth looked at him. "You brought help, huh?" The young man followed his gaze. "Thought he ran off." "Apparently not." Gareth removed his gloves. The cold bit immediately. He tested the floor with one hand and shifted his weight toward a support beam. "What's your name?" "Mason." "Last name?" The young man clenched his jaw as Gareth repositioned his trapped leg. "Kerr." Gareth's hands stopped. Only for a fraction of a second, but it stopped. The storm disappeared. The cold disappeared. Even Ranger seemed to vanish from Gareth's awareness. Kerr. There were names a man heard and forgot before the day was over. There were names that stayed buried so deep they became part of the bones. Daniel Kerr had been dead nearly 20 years. Gareth had not spoken the name aloud in months, maybe longer. He looked at the young man again, noticed the eyes this time, gray-blue, not Daniel's. The jaw was different too, still. Mason Kerr? Yeah. Gareth forced himself back into motion. "Hold on to that beam." Mason frowned. "You know me?" "No." The lie came easily, too easily. Gareth hooked an arm under Mason's shoulder. "On 3. The extraction took less than 2 minutes and felt much longer. Mason's right leg had been pinned against a bent metal panel rather than crushed beneath it. Gareth lifted the damaged section enough for Mason to pull free, then dragged him carefully onto solid flooring. Mason sucked air through his teeth and pressed both hands around his thigh. "Can you stand?" "Probably." "That isn't what I asked." Mason looked at him. "No." "Good. We agree." For the first time, something like amusement crossed Mason's face. Gareth almost smiled back. Almost. He slipped Mason's arm over his shoulders and brought him upright. Mason was lighter than expected, though the awkwardness of the injury made the short walk difficult. Ranger moved ahead. Outside, the storm had worsened. The dog took the lead again, choosing the clearest route through the accumulating snow. Gareth concentrated on Mason's weight, the uneven ground, and the pickup beyond the gate. Anything except the name. Kerr. By the time they reached the truck, Mason was shivering hard. Gareth opened the passenger door and eased him inside. "Hospital?" "Clinic's enough." "You a doctor?" "No." "Then hospital." "Closest hospital's nearly 50 miles. Gareth looked toward the storm. Mason was right. Timberline Falls had a small emergency clinic that stayed open for industrial injuries. "Clinic." Mason nodded. Ranger stood beside the truck. Gareth opened the rear door. The shepherd jumped in without hesitation. Only after Ranger settled onto the back seat did Gareth notice the plastic employee badge hanging from Mason's outer jacket. It had flipped forward while Gareth lifted him. The flashlight from the cab caught the white lettering. Mason Kerr, Field Maintenance Technician. Gareth stared at it. For years he had told himself that certain pieces of the past were finished simply because no one came asking for them. Daniel had died. Gareth had left. The world had continued. That was the arrangement. But now, Daniel Kerr's name was sitting 3 feet away from him in a snow-covered pickup beside an abandoned pumping station. Alive in someone else's face. Gareth closed the passenger door. For a moment he stood alone in the storm, one hand resting against the cold metal. Ranger watched him through the rear window. The broken chain still hung from the dog's collar. Gareth looked at it longer than he meant to. Then he walked around the truck, climbed behind the wheel, and started the engine. He did not ask Mason another question. Not yet. The Timberline Falls Clinic had 3 examination rooms. one vending machine that hummed louder than the heating system, and a waiting area decorated with photographs of mountains taken in warmer months. At 2 in the morning, it felt less like a medical facility than a place the town had agreed to keep awake for emergencies. Gareth sat beneath a framed photograph of wildflowers while snow pressed softly against the windows. Ranger lay at his boots. The dog had accepted a bowl of water from the receptionist but refused to settle anywhere except beside Gareth's chair. The broken chain had been removed from his collar and placed in a clear plastic bag on the counter, along with the metal tag bearing his name. Gareth kept looking at the exam room door. Not because Mason's injury seemed life-threatening, because of the name. Kerr. He had spent the drive from Pumping Station 6 refusing to ask the obvious question. There had been practical reasons. Mason was cold. His leg needed attention. The roads were worsening. Gareth had needed to concentrate. All of that was true. None of it was the reason. The reason was that Gareth had already begun constructing ways the name could mean nothing. Kerr was not rare. Wyoming had plenty of Kerrs. North Dakota had plenty of Kerrs. America had plenty. A man could spend 20 years carrying one name inside him and still encounter it by accident. That was what Gareth told himself until the exam room door opened. Mason stepped out on crutches. His work jacket was folded under one arm. The clinic had wrapped his right knee and lower thigh in a compression bandage. His face had regained some color, though exhaustion made him look younger than 24. A nurse followed him. "No fracture," she said. "Bad contusion, strained knee, probably a few ugly colors by morning. Keep weight off it tonight. Ice, elevation. If swelling gets worse, come back." Mason nodded. "I know the speech. You apparently don't know what floors are for." That earned a tired grin. The nurse looked toward Gareth. "You driving in?" "Yes." "Then make sure he doesn't decide he's indestructible before breakfast." Mason shifted on the crutches. "I'm standing right here." "That's the concern." She disappeared through the swinging door. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Ranger stood. The shepherd crossed the waiting room and stopped beside Mason, pressing his shoulder lightly against Mason's uninjured leg. Mason reached down and scratched the thick fur behind the dog's right ear. "Where'd you get him?" Gareth asked. Mason glanced up. "Didn't." Gareth waited. "He belongs to Wes Hallbrook, safety supervisor out at 6. The answer produced more questions than it solved, but Gareth left them alone. For now. Mason adjusted the crutches and looked through the window. "Road still bad?" "Worse." "Figures. You have somewhere in town?" "My place is south side."
"Apartment over the old laundromat."
"I'll take you." Mason looked at him for a moment. "You already pulled me out of a floor." "That doesn't make the road shorter." Another pause. "Okay." They moved toward the exit. Gareth held the door while Mason maneuvered through it. The cold outside had sharpened. Snowflakes had become smaller, faster, almost granular against the skin. The parking lot was buried except where the clinic's maintenance truck had made 2 narrow passes. Gareth loaded the crutches behind the seat. Ranger jumped into the rear of the cab. Mason settled into the passenger side with obvious discomfort. Only after Gareth started the engine did Mason notice the field watch on Gareth's wrist. His gaze lingered. Gareth noticed. "What?" "Nothing." "That wasn't nothing." Mason leaned his head back against the seat. "My dad had one like that." The heater fan seemed suddenly too loud. Gareth kept his eyes on the windshield. "Lots of people dead." "Yeah." Mason looked toward the dark storefronts as they pulled away. "My mother hated his." Gareth's hand tightened slightly on the wheel. "Why?" "Said it made him check the time when there wasn't anywhere he needed to be." The sentence struck with such precision that Gareth almost missed the turn. Daniel had done that. Not because of the watch itself, because he measured everything. Distance, time, fuel, ammunition, light. Even on leave, Daniel used to glance at his wrist before crossing a street, before entering a restaurant, before agreeing to another drink, as though life might suddenly require an extraction window. Gareth heard himself ask, "Your father served?" Mason turned. "Yeah." The answer was cautious now. "Navy?" "SEALs." Gareth felt the old scar below his ribs tighten, though cold had nothing to do with it. Mason continued before Gareth could decide whether to speak. "Daniel Kerr." There it was. Not a possibility anymore, not coincidence. The road narrowed ahead, headlights sliding over snowbanks and the dark shapes of parked cars. Gareth drove another block before answering. "I knew a Daniel Kerr." Mason stared at him. The heater pushed warm air between them. Ranger raised his head from the back seat. "What do you mean, new?" Gareth had rehearsed versions of this conversation without realizing it, not with Mason, with Daniel's widow, with Daniel's parents, with people Gareth had imagined calling and then never called. In those imagined conversations, there had always been a perfect first sentence. There was no perfect sentence now. "We served together." Mason's expression changed very little. That made it worse. "You were in his team?" "For part of it. How long?" "Long enough." Mason looked away. The apartment building appeared 2 blocks ahead, but he did not tell Gareth to stop. Instead, he asked, "Why didn't you say something at the station? You were trapped in a floor. At the clinic. You were getting treated. And now?" Gareth had no useful answer. Mason gave a dry laugh without humor. "Right." Gareth pulled into an empty parking space beside the old laundromat. The neon sign downstairs had been switched off years ago, leaving only faint lettering on the glass. Neither man moved to open a door. Mason stared forward. "My mother used to say there were men who would call after he died." Gareth said nothing. "She thought people from his unit would check in, tell stories, maybe tell me what he was like over there." The last 2 words came out quieter. "Did they?" "1 or 2 did, at first." Mason rubbed his thumb along the handle of one crutch. "Christmas cards, a phone call. Then less, then nothing." Gareth felt each sentence as something earned, not accusation, evidence. Mason finally looked at him.
I used to think maybe that meant he wasn't important to them.
He was. The answer came too quickly. Mason's eyes sharpened. "You sound sure." "I am." "Then where were you?" Gareth looked down at his hands. The question was simpler than the truth. He had been in Virginia for a while, then Nevada, then Montana. He had taken contract work, turned down calls, changed numbers, stopped opening certain envelopes. But none of those places answered Mason. "I stayed away." "Why?" Gareth's throat tightened. Because Daniel had died while Gareth was still breathing. Because Gareth had made a decision in a place filled with smoke and shouting and believed for years that one different choice might have brought Daniel home. Because facing Daniel's family would have required hearing gratitude he did not think he deserved, or anger he could not defend himself against. Because silence had become easier than courage. "I thought I had no right." Mason studied him. "To do what?" "To show up." "That's convenient." The words were not loud. Gareth would have preferred loud. Anger could be met. Quiet disappointment had nowhere to go. Ranger rose in the back seat and pushed his muzzle between the 2 front headrests. Mason touched the dog absently. The movement softened nothing between the men, but it changed the shape of the silence. Gareth looked at the shepherd's collar. No broken chain now. Only the worn leather and the metal name tag. For the first time that night, Gareth understood that something could be freed without knowing where it belonged next. Mason broke the silence. How did he die? Gareth looked at him. Mason's face was guarded, but underneath it was something much younger. Not a technician. Not a man who had fallen through a corroded floor. A son who had spent years with an incomplete story. You know the official version? Training accident. Gareth's jaw tightened. No. Mason went still. No? It wasn't training. Then what was it? Gareth looked through the windshield. Snow covered the old laundromat steps. A street lamp leaned slightly over the road, haloed in white. This was the moment he could tell everything. He could unload 20 years into a parked truck and call it honesty. But Mason was injured, exhausted, and had just discovered a stranger knew his father. Gareth had spent years choosing silence for himself. He did not want to choose the timing for Mason, too. An operation overseas. Mason waited. What kind? I can't give you every detail. Can't or won't. Some of it can't. Some of it... Gareth stopped. Some of it I haven't known how to say. Mason leaned back slowly. That answer seemed to disturb him more than a refusal would have. Were you there? Yes. When he died? Yes. Mason looked down. The muscles in his jaw tightened. Gareth could almost see the questions reorganizing themselves. What happened? Gareth did not answer immediately. He remembered a concrete stairwell. A radio clipped too tightly to his vest. Daniel's voice through static. A decision made in seconds. A door they should have reached earlier. A route Gareth had chosen because the alternate looked worse. Years later, none of those details had become less sharp. I made a call, Gareth said. Mason looked at him again. It went wrong. There. Not the whole truth, but more than Gareth had told another human being in years. Mason's expression hardened. What kind of call? Gareth shook his head. Not tonight. Mason laughed once. You drop that in my lap and then tell me not tonight? You're tired. Don't do that. Do what? Decide what I can handle. Gareth absorbed the hit. You're right. The words seemed to surprise Mason. Gareth continued. But I'm not going to tell you the worst night of my life in pieces because I'm cornered in a parking lot. Mason looked out the side window. For a long time, the only sound was Ranger breathing behind them. Then Mason said, My mom died 5 years ago. Gareth closed his eyes briefly. He had not known. Cancer. I'm sorry. She spent 20 years believing she didn't know the full story. Gareth had no defense against that. Mason opened the door. Cold air flooded the cab. Before getting out, he looked back at Gareth. You know what I thought when nobody came? Gareth waited. I thought maybe my dad was the kind of man people forgot once the funeral was over. Gareth turned fully toward him. He wasn't. Then somebody should have acted like it. Mason climbed out. Gareth came around to help despite expecting Mason to refuse. He did not. Together they crossed the short distance to the stairs. Ranger followed as far as the bottom step. Mason turned. He can't stay here. Gareth looked at the dog. Why not? Lease. Of course. Mason rubbed Ranger's head. Wes would kill me if I left him outside. You said Ranger belongs to Wes. Yeah. Where is Wes? Mason's hand stopped on the dog's neck. For the first time, something uneasy entered his face that had nothing to do with Daniel. I don't know. Gareth waited. Mason shook his head. Not tonight. The echo was deliberate. Gareth almost deserved the small satisfaction Mason took from it. Fair enough. Mason looked at Ranger, then Gareth. "Can you keep him until morning?" Gareth glanced down at the shepherd. Ranger sat beside him as though the question had already been settled. "One night." Mason gave the faintest smile. "Sure." Gareth helped him to the landing. At the apartment door, Mason stopped. "My dad ever talk about me?" Gareth felt the question land deeper than any accusation had, and this time the answer was simple. "No." Mason nodded slowly. Something closed behind his eyes. Gareth hated himself for causing it, even though lying would have been worse.
I didn't know you existed.
Mason opened the door. "Guess there's a lot neither of us knew." Then he went inside. Gareth remained on the stairs for several seconds after the door shut. Below, Ranger waited in the falling snow. Gareth looked down at him. "You really know how to pick people." Ranger tilted his head. Gareth descended the steps. He did not feel forgiven. He did not feel redeemed. He only felt the distance between 20 years ago and tonight. For the first time, that distance had a face. By late morning, the storm had weakened into a fine, steady snowfall. Timberline Falls looked washed clean and half abandoned under it. Gareth had slept less than 3 hours. Ranger had slept near the cabin door. The dog had refused the old wool blanket Gareth placed beside the stove, and chosen the bare floor instead, curled with his muzzle resting on his paws, ears lifting whenever the wind changed outside. Gareth had watched him longer than he meant to. There was something familiar about a creature that could rest without ever fully surrendering awareness. At 7:30, Gareth made coffee. At 8, he called the number printed on Ranger's metal tag. No answer. At 8:15, he called Timberline Gas. That conversation lasted 4 minutes. The woman at the regional office confirmed the name Wes Holbrook, then became noticeably less helpful. Yes, Holbrook had worked as a safety supervisor. No, he was no longer employed there. No, she could not give Gareth a home address. As for Ranger, she had no information. When Gareth mentioned finding the dog at Pumping Station 6, the woman paused long enough for him to notice. Then she told him the site was closed and he should avoid entering company property. Gareth thanked her. He did not mention the collapsed floor. He called Mason next. Mason answered on the 4th ring. "You awake?" "I am now." "You know Wes Holbrook's address?" Silence. Then, "Why?" "Because his dog is eating my breakfast." Gareth looked toward Ranger. The shepherd was sitting 6 feet away, staring at Gareth's plate with disciplined interest. Mason exhaled. "He doesn't live in town." "Where?" "Small place off County Road 9, west side." "You been there?" "Once." "You willing to show me?" Another pause. "My knee says no." "I have a truck." "My knee still says no." "You know where he is?" "No." That answer changed Gareth's tone. What does that mean? "It means nobody knows." Gareth set down his coffee. Mason continued before he could ask. "Wes disappeared before 6 shut down." "How long before?" "About a week." "And nobody mentioned that last night?" "You were busy telling me my father didn't die where I was told he died." "Fair." Gareth leaned against the kitchen counter. "What did the company say?" "That Wes quit." "You believe that?" "No." The answer came immediately. Gareth looked toward Ranger again. The dog had stopped watching the food. Now Ranger was looking at the door. Mason arrived 20 minutes later in a faded Navy work jacket, moving stiffly on crutches. Gareth had driven into town to get him because letting Mason attempt icy stairs and a snow-packed sidewalk alone had seemed irresponsible. Mason had objected to being collected. He had objected again when Gareth carried the crutches to the truck. He stopped objecting when Ranger pushed his head between the seats and licked the back of Mason's glove once. "Traitor," Mason said. Ranger sat down. Gareth drove west. The road out of Timberline Falls crossed open pasture before narrowing through low hills. Snow clung to the sagebrush and collected along fence lines in smooth, wind-carved shelves. Mason gave directions. After 11 miles, they turned onto County Road 9. Another 3 brought them to a single-story house set back from the road behind a stand of cottonwoods. Wes Holbrook's place. No tire tracks crossed the driveway. The mailbox had a crust of snow around its door. Gareth parked. "Stay here." Mason gave him a look. "I'm injured, not 80. You fall again, I'm not carrying you twice in 24 hours. You absolutely would." Gareth closed the door before answering. Ranger jumped down from the rear seat. The change in the dog was immediate. His head lifted, his pace quickened, not frantic, certain. Gareth followed him toward the front porch. There were no recent human footprints. Ranger sniffed the bottom step, then the door, then moved along the side of the house. Gareth knocked anyway. "Mr. Holbrook?" Nothing. The curtains were closed. A covered pickup sat beneath a lean-to beside the house. Snow lay thick across the tarp. That interested Gareth. If Wes had left Wyoming voluntarily, he had not taken the truck. Mason had made his way down from the cab and was approaching carefully on the crutches. "You said stay there. And you said he wasn't here." "I said no such thing." Mason looked toward the covered vehicle. "That's his Ford." "You sure?" "He complained about that truck every shift." Ranger continued behind the house. They followed. A small fenced run stood beside a storage shed. Its gate hung open. An empty stainless steel water bowl sat half buried in snow. Ranger entered the run and sniffed the ground, then came back out. Mason watched him. "He was kept here sometimes." "You know the dog well?" "Enough." "Why was Ranger at 6? "Wes brought him in nights." Gareth glanced at him. "Company allowed that?" "Company allowed a lot when nobody important was looking." There was bitterness in the sentence. Not theatrical bitterness, the tired kind, the kind built over months of being told that practical problems were inconvenient. Gareth went to the back door. Locked. Nothing looked forced, no shattered glass, no obvious sign that anyone had left in a hurry. Mason shifted his weight and winced. "What?" "Nothing. That usually means something." "My knee hurts." "Sit." "There's nowhere to sit." Gareth pointed at an overturned feed bucket beneath the shed roof. Mason stared at it. "You have a gift for hospitality." "Sit." Mason did. Ranger suddenly moved away from the house, not toward the road, toward the eastern edge of the property. "Ranger." The dog ignored Gareth. He passed through the open run gate, crossed behind the shed, and stopped at a wire fence. Beyond it lay an old service track running through the snow. Ranger slipped beneath a loose lower strand. Gareth stopped. Mason looked up. "What?" "Your friend is leaving." Mason pushed himself upright. "He does that." "What?" "Not leaving." Mason looked past Gareth toward the dog. "Going back." They followed the track by truck. Calling it a road was generous. Snow had filled most of the tire ruts, and Gareth kept the pickup in four-wheel drive while Ranger trotted ahead whenever the drifts were shallow enough. Every few hundred yards the dog stopped, waited, then continued. Mason watched through the windshield. "He did this before." "When?" "The week Wes disappeared." Gareth glanced at him. "You followed him?" "Once." "Where?" "You'll see." The answer irritated Gareth. Not because it was evasive, because Mason sounded exactly like someone who had learned to keep pieces of information to himself until he knew they would be taken seriously. Gareth knew that habit too well. The service track eventually curved south. A series of yellow marker posts appeared beside it. Natural gas pipeline.
Ranger left the track. He moved toward one of the markers, then continued along the buried line. Mason's posture changed. He leaned forward despite the knee. "Stop here." Gareth did. They stepped out into the cold. The landscape was almost featureless. White ground, gray sky, low ridges in the distance. Only the pipeline markers broke the emptiness. Ranger went another 50 yards, then stopped beside a squat metal enclosure half covered by snow. A pressure monitoring station. Mason stared. "This is it." Gareth looked from him to Ranger. "It?" "Wes used to come out here." "How often?" "Too often, according to management." Mason moved carefully through the snow. Gareth stayed near him without making the help obvious. The metal housing had a numbered plate. 6L17 West Monitor. Ranger sniffed around the base, then sat. No barking, no scratching, just waiting. Gareth studied the dog. He expects somebody. Probably Wes. Mason brushed snow from the enclosure with one gloved hand. "You said Wes disappeared a week before the station closed." "Yeah." "What was happening out here?" Mason hesitated. Gareth let him. Finally, Mason said, "Pressure readings." "What about them?" "Didn't match." Gareth waited. Mason tapped the housing. This monitor was giving one number, central control was showing another. "How far apart?" "Sometimes not much." "That doesn't answer the question." "Enough that Wes noticed." Mason looked toward the pipeline stretching invisibly beneath the snow. At first he thought the sensor was failing. "Was it?" "I don't know." "You worked maintenance." "I worked maintenance, not instrumentation." There was an edge in Mason's voice. Then he caught himself. "Sorry." "You don't owe me polite." Mason crouched awkwardly beside the housing, keeping his injured legs straight. He started checking it manually, took readings, logged them. Then he reported it. "And?" "Got told the system had already been reviewed." Gareth looked at him. "You believe it had?" "No." "Why?" "Because 2 days later, Wes came into the break room angry enough to throw his gloves at a wall." Gareth could picture the scene without effort, not because he knew Wes, because every workplace had a moment where a man stopped arguing about procedure and started realizing procedure had become a shield. What did he say? Mason stared at the metal housing. That they were smoothing numbers. Gareth's expression changed. Smoothing? That was his word. Mason stood carefully. He thought the pressure spikes were being averaged out in the reports. Why? Don't know. Did you report anything? Mason nodded. Once. To who? My shift supervisor. And? He told me the line was scheduled for closure anyway. Said there was no point creating a problem for a system being taken offline. Gareth looked across the snow. That line isn't offline. Mason's eyes moved to him. How do you know? Gareth pointed toward the housing. A faint vibration traveled through the metal pipe, entering the ground beneath it. Not much, but present. Mason went still, then placed his hand against the pipe. His face changed. Damn. You expected dead? Mostly. Mostly is not a technical term. No. Mason withdrew his hand. They reduced flow through this section, didn't shut the whole branch. Ranger stood. The shepherd moved 10 yards farther along the pipeline and lowered his nose to the snow. Gareth watched. This time he did not immediately follow. Instead, he looked at Mason. "Wes brought Ranger here?" "Almost every inspection." "Why?" "He said it beat leaving him alone at home for 12 hours. Gareth looked back at the dog. That changed the meaning of everything. Ranger was not discovering a hidden place. He was returning to routine. A path learned by repetition, a stop associated with one specific man. The dog paced another few yards, then returned to the monitor. Waited. Gareth felt the pieces settle into a shape he did not like. The house with no vehicle gone. The dog left near pumping station 6. The monitoring station Wes had repeatedly checked. The missing week. The company's neat explanation that Wes simply quit. Gareth had spent enough of his life distrusting dramatic conclusions to avoid making one now. But he also knew the difference between coincidence and pattern. "What was the last thing Wes said to you?" Mason frowned. "About what?" "Before he disappeared." Mason thought. Snow collected along the shoulders of his jacket. "He asked me if I trusted digital logs." Gareth said nothing. "I told him, depends who enters them." "Then?" He laughed. "What kind of laugh?" Mason looked at Gareth as though the question were odd, then understood why he had asked. "Not funny." "What else?" He said, "Good answer." Ranger came back and sat between them. Mason rested a hand against the dog's neck. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Mason said, "You think he left Ranger at the station on purpose?" "I don't know. Because if he did, I said I don't know." Mason's jaw tightened. Gareth softened his tone. "Don't build the answer before we have the facts." "You always talk like that?" "Only when people are about to do something stupid." Mason almost smiled. Almost. Then he looked down at Ranger. Wes wouldn't leave him. That statement carried more conviction than anything Mason had said all morning. Gareth believed him. Not because of evidence. Because Ranger had been found exactly where a loyal dog might wait if told to stay, or where a loyal dog might return if the person who usually came back never did. Gareth walked to the pressure housing. Snow had melted where Mason's glove touched the metal. He stared at the stamped identification plate. 6L17. A small thing, a number on steel. But Gareth had learned long ago that disasters rarely began with explosions. They began with small inconsistencies someone found inconvenient. A number that did not match. A report adjusted. A warning delayed. A man told not to make trouble. Behind him, Ranger gave a low exhale and lay down beside the pipeline marker. Not searching. Waiting. That disturbed Gareth more than any bark could have. Mason looked toward him. "So what now?" Gareth turned away from the monitor. "Now?" He glanced at Ranger. "We stop assuming the dog is lost." Mason followed his gaze. Gareth continued. "He knows exactly where he's going." The wind moved across the buried pipeline, lifting powder from the ground in thin white ribbons. Ranger stayed beside the marker, facing the empty service road, waiting for Wes Hallbrook to come back. The notice went up at pumping station 6 just after noon. A laminated sheet had been zip-tied to the main gate, its corners already beginning to curl in the cold. Site access terminates at 1700 hours. Property to be sealed pending decommissioning review. Mason read it twice. Then he looked at Gareth. "My tools are still inside." Gareth stood beside the pickup with both hands in the pockets of his canvas jacket. "Then get your tools." Mason frowned. "That simple?" "It should be." The answer mattered. Neither man had any interest in sneaking through fences, copying company servers, or pretending two civilians in winter jackets were investigators. Whatever was wrong at Pumping Station 6, Gareth had no intention of turning suspicion into evidence by breaking into something. Mason still had an employee badge. The shutdown notice did not take effect for another 4 hours. They had one legitimate reason to go inside. That would be enough. Ranger stayed in the truck. Gareth insisted on that. The dog had already brought them farther into Wes Holbrook's unfinished business than anyone could reasonably expect. There was no reason to turn Ranger into an excuse for entering restricted areas again. Mason climbed out carefully. His knee had improved enough that he had traded 2 crutches for 1, though his gait remained uneven. He wore the same faded navy work jacket from the day before, the hem dusted with road salt, and a gray knit cap pulled low over his dark hair. "You're sure about this?" Gareth asked. Mason looked toward the gate. "I've got about $800 worth of tools in there." "That wasn't what I meant." "I know." He started walking. Gareth followed. A site representative met them near the maintenance building. His name was Colin Vale, according to the stitched patch above the chest pocket of his insulated company coat. He was perhaps 40, narrow through the shoulders, clean-shaven, with a tired administrative manner that suggested he had spent the morning repeating rules to unhappy employees. "You Kerr?" Mason showed his badge. "Field maintenance. Until 5. Apparently." Colin ignored the tone. "You can collect personal property and assigned tools. Nothing from control, instrumentation, record storage, or locked cabinets." "I'm not here for records." Colin looked at Gareth. "And him?" "He drove me." "I can walk back to the truck," Gareth said. Mason glanced at his knee. "Stay." Colin considered that, then shrugged. "Fine. 20 minutes. Gareth disliked deadlines imposed for no practical reason, but he kept the opinion to himself. The maintenance building looked different in daylight, less threatening, more neglected. The collapsed floor where Gareth had found Mason had been covered with a sheet of plywood and surrounded by orange cones. A handwritten warning had been taped to the wall. Mason stared at it. "That's new." "Progress," Gareth said. "Nothing says safety like plywood." Colin remained outside. Inside, Mason moved toward a row of dented metal lockers. His was marked with masking tape and black marker. "Kerr, night." He opened it. A thermos, spare gloves, 2 socket sets, a multimeter, a rolled rain shell, a battered red tool case. Normal things. Gareth stayed near the doorway and let Mason work. This was Mason's place, not his. The distinction felt important. Mason filled the tool case methodically. For several minutes they barely spoke. Then Mason opened the bottom compartment of the locker and stopped. "What?" Mason reached inside. A black notebook came out beneath a coil of electrical leads. It was small enough to fit in a jacket pocket, covered in waterproof synthetic material, corners rounded from use. Gareth recognized it immediately from Mason's description of Wes. "You put that there?" "No." "Could Wes have?" Mason turned the notebook over. A strip of white tape crossed the back. Written in permanent marker were 3 letters. W.H. Mason exhaled through his nose. "That's his." Gareth did not touch it. "Why would it be in your locker?" "I don't know." "Think." Mason stared at the notebook. "Wes used my locker sometimes when inspection dragged into night shift." "For what?" "Coffee, batteries. He knew I kept spare gloves." "That enough reason?" "No." Mason opened the cover. The first pages were ordinary. Dates, equipment IDs, pressure checks, temperature readings, short comments in block handwriting. "Seal OK," Repeat after temp drop, verage gauge. Nothing dramatic, nothing hidden. That made the later pages harder to dismiss. Mason's finger stopped halfway through the book. Here. Gareth stepped closer. A sequence of readings had been written down over 12 days. Line 6-L17. The same identifier stamped onto the monitoring housing Ranger had led them to. Mason traced the values. Look at this. Gareth looked. The numbers meant little without context. Explain. This is inlet pressure, Mason pointed. This is what Wes wrote manually. Then lower. And this is what Central was reporting. 2 values were written beside one another. They were close, but not the same. Another day showed a wider difference, then another. Mason turned the page. The gap widened again. Gareth watched his expression change. Not fear, recognition. You've seen these numbers before. I've seen the official ones. Where? Shift summary. Mason sat on the edge of the workbench. He pulled out his phone. No signal in here. Do you need one? I have screenshots. Gareth looked at him. Of company records? Of my shift locks. That allowed? I used to photograph my entries before closing them. Why? Mason gave him a flat look. Because people edit things. That answer had probably been learned, not inherited. He scrolled through stored images. A set of timestamps appeared. The dates matched several entries in Wes's notebook. Mason compared them. Once, twice, then again more slowly. This isn't right. Gareth waited. Mason held up the phone. On the official shift summary, the pressure remained below the internal alert threshold. In Wes's handwritten note from the same hour, the manual reading crossed it. Not by a catastrophic amount. Enough to matter. Mason flipped forward. Another mismatch, then another. Could Wes have measured wrong? Mason did not answer immediately. That's possible. Could the central sensor have been wrong? Also possible. Then, don't call it anything else yet. Mason nodded. The caution irritated him, but he accepted it. Then he found the page that changed the room. 3 readings had red marks beside them, not circles. Short vertical strokes, perhaps made with a grease pencil. Next to the first, auto log reset, 0214. Next to the second, high event not in morning summary. Next to the third, asked again, told transient. Mason stopped breathing for a moment. Gareth saw it. What does that mean? It means Wes saw a high-pressure event. And? It should have remained in the event history. Should? Unless the system purged it automatically. Does it? No. Mason looked at him. Not that kind of event. The room seemed suddenly smaller. Gareth took one step back. What are you saying? I'm saying if this is accurate, someone removed it. From what? The summary history. Can you prove that from a notebook? No. The answer came sharply. Then Mason looked down. No, I can't. Gareth nodded once. Good. Mason stared at him. Good. Good that you know the difference. For the first time since they entered, Mason looked less like an angry young technician and more like someone standing at the edge of a decision that could change his job, his reputation, and possibly more than that. He closed the notebook, then opened it again. That small movement told Gareth everything. Mason was afraid to keep looking. He was more afraid not to. They took the notebook outside. Colin checked the tool case. He did not ask about the black notebook. That surprised Gareth. Then Mason turned it over and realized why. No company inventory label, no asset number. Personal property, at least on the surface. They drove directly to Mason's apartment. Ranger greeted them at the truck with restrained excitement, pushing his muzzle briefly against Mason's forearm before settling beside the rear door. Inside, Mason spread the notebook, his own shift photographs, and an old printed pipeline map across the small kitchen table. Gareth stood back. This part belonged to Mason. "What are you looking for?" "Line routing." "You know it already." "I know most of it." Mason traced 6L17 with one finger. The line left Pumping Station 6, bent northwest, crossed open ground, then turned toward Timberline Falls. The map was several years old. One section had been highlighted in yellow. Mason leaned closer. "What?" He pointed. "This branch." "What about it?" "It feeds the West Regulator." "That important?" "It crosses under the county approach road." Gareth looked down at the map. Timberline Falls sat between low ridges, and the western road served as the most reliable year-round route into town when the smaller southern route drifted shut. "The main road?" "In winter, pretty much." Gareth looked at him. Mason tapped another symbol. "This is the old pressure control valve." "Old? How?" "Older than me." "That doesn't answer much." "It should have been replaced 2 capital cycles ago." "Why wasn't it?" "Money." Mason said it without drama. Not corruption, not conspiracy, just money. Often enough, that was all a bad decision needed. He pulled one of the shift photographs closer. If Wes was right, and the lines seeing spikes the central record isn't showing, then that valve may be taking more load than everybody thinks. May. Yes. And if it fails? Mason hesitated. Gareth noticed. "Don't give me the cinematic version." Mason almost smiled. "I wasn't going to." "Good. The immediate issue isn't that the whole town explodes. Better? The concern is uncontrolled pressure downstream, line damage, forced isolation, possible leak, loss of service. In this weather. Exactly." Outside the window, the snow had stopped. The sky had turned the hard pale gray that often came before a temperature drop. Mason checked his phone. The forecast had updated. He read silently, then placed the phone on the table. "What?" Cold front moved faster. "How cold?" 28 below tomorrow night. Wind chill worse. Gareth looked at the map again. High demand, old regulator, questionable readings, a system that might not be reporting every event accurately. None of it proved disaster. Together, it proved something simpler. Someone qualified needed to look at it. Mason picked up the notebook. "I'm going back." "To where?" 6. "No." "There might be more logs." "No." Mason's face hardened. "You don't get to correct. I don't get to order you around." Gareth leaned both hands on the table. "But I do get to tell you when an idea is stupid. I know the equipment. You also have one functioning knee. That's not the point. No. The point is, you already have enough to make someone official start asking questions." Mason looked away. "Company won't." "I didn't say company." Mason looked back. Gareth nodded toward the notebook. "State regulator, pipeline safety office, whoever has jurisdiction. And while they take 3 days to answer an email, then you call. And if they don't care, then you call again." Mason's frustration rose. "That's your plan?" "That's how evidence works." Mason laughed bitterly. "You trust systems now?" "No." The answer stopped him. Gareth straightened. "I trust records more when they exist in more than one place." Silence. Ranger stood from the kitchen floor and moved toward the window, not alarmed, just watching the weather. Gareth continued. "You make copies. You keep the original. You send the information somewhere the company can't quietly edit it. Then you let people with authority decide what happens next. Mason looked down at Wes's notebook. This was his. Yes. He might have been trying to do exactly that. Maybe. And now he's gone. Gareth did not soften the truth.
That's why you don't go chasing this alone. For several seconds, Mason said nothing. Then he opened his laptop. The movement was small. It felt bigger than anything they had done at the station. Wyoming pipeline safety, he said. Start there. Mason began scanning pages of Wes's notebook with his phone. Gareth made coffee. Neither of them called what they were doing an investigation. It was documentation. That distinction kept Gareth comfortable enough to stay. By late afternoon, Mason had assembled a short package, photographs of the notebook pages, his corresponding shift screenshots, the pipeline section, dates, equipment numbers, and a factual explanation stripped of accusation. No claims of fraud, no claim of sabotage, just discrepancies. Possible deleted high-pressure events. A line still carrying flow. An aging regulator. A severe cold front approaching. Mason read the message one final time, then looked at Gareth. You want to check it? No. Why? Because your name goes on it. Mason considered that, then nodded. He sent it. For a moment, nothing happened. No sirens, no phone call, no sudden proof that they were right, just a small confirmation message appearing on the screen. Report received. Mason leaned back. That feels underwhelming. Most useful things do. The first wind hit the building 20 minutes later, hard enough to rattle the kitchen window. Ranger's ears lifted. Gareth looked outside. Snow had begun moving again, but this time it was not falling gently, it was coming sideways, fast. The weather alert on Mason's phone sounded almost immediately. Winter storm warning upgraded, rapid temperature drop, heavy blowing snow, road closures possible. Mason read it, then looked toward the pipeline map still spread across the table. Neither man said anything. The report was filed. The evidence was no longer only in Wes Holbrook's notebook. But whatever happened next would now have to happen in a storm. The road west of Timberline Falls stayed closed through the night. By morning, the county had shut the southern route too. Snow had buried the ditches and climbed halfway up the fence posts outside Mason's apartment. The wind came in long, steady pushes that made the old building creak around its seams. There was nowhere to go. For once, Gareth could not solve that by leaving. Mason sat at the kitchen table with his injured legs stretched onto another chair. Wes Holbrook's notebook had been moved away from the edge and covered with a clean dish towel, not because either man thought it needed protecting from anything specific, but because staring at it had become exhausting. The state report had been acknowledged. No inspector could reach them yet. That left time. Gareth disliked time when there was nothing physical to do with it. He had already checked the windows twice, cleared the exterior steps, brought up extra firewood for the small cast-iron stove in Mason's living room, and repaired a loose latch on the kitchen cabinet without being asked. Mason watched him tighten the final screw. You always fix things when you don't want to talk? Gareth put the screwdriver down. Mostly. Convenient skill. I've found it useful. Ranger lay between the kitchen and living room, front paws crossed, eyes moving from one man to the other. Mason picked up his coffee. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway. You said my dad gave you an order. Gareth did not pretend he had forgotten. Yes. You also said you made a call that went wrong. Yes. So which one is true? Both. Mason leaned back. Then start there. The request was quiet. That made refusing it harder.
Gareth moved to the window. Outside, visibility was less than 100 yards. The neighboring buildings were pale shapes behind blowing snow.
For years, Gareth had remembered Daniel's final mission in fragments. Not like a story. Stories had beginnings and endings. Memory did not. Memory gave him a stairwell when he was trying to sleep, a radio transmission while washing dishes, the metallic taste of dust for no reason in the middle of summer. A voice that had been silent for nearly 20 years, suddenly clear enough to make him turn his head. Gareth rested one hand on the window frame. "We were operating with another element," he said. "Small team. The objective changed after we were already inside." Mason said nothing. "We were supposed to be in and out before daylight." "Where?" "I can't give you the location." Mason's mouth tightened. Gareth turned. "That part isn't me avoiding you." "Fine." "There was contact earlier than expected. Our primary route closed. I chose an alternate withdrawal point." Gareth paused. "That was the call I told you about." Mason looked at him closely. "You chose wrong?" "At the time I thought so." "And now?" Gareth took a breath. "I chose the route with the best information I had." "That sounds different." "It is." "Why?" "Because I've had 20 years to argue with a man who isn't here." Mason lowered his eyes. Gareth continued. "The alternate route got us farther out, but one of the other men was injured. We lost time. Daniel was covering the rear." The room seemed to become quieter. Even the wind felt distant. "We reached a choke point," Gareth said. "Narrow passage, bad visibility, too many people trying to move through the same space." Mason's fingers tightened around the coffee cup. "What happened to him?" "He stayed behind." Mason looked up. "Because you told him to?" "No." The answer was immediate. Gareth stepped away from the window. "He told me to move." Mason stared at him. Gareth could see Daniel again, not the photograph, the man. Helmet pushed slightly back because he always wore it a fraction higher than regulation. Dust across one cheek. One glove dark with somebody else's blood. Calm voice. Too calm. "There were 3 of us in front of him," Gareth said. "One man couldn't move without help. Daniel knew if we stopped in that corridor, everyone stacked behind us." "And you left him." There was no cruelty in Mason's words, only a son trying to put the event into a sentence. Gareth nodded. "Yes." Mason's jaw hardened. "You said you tried to go back." "I did." "When?" "Twice." "What stopped you?" "The first time, Daniel did." Mason frowned. "Over the radio?" "Yes." "And the second?" Gareth looked down. "The structure started coming apart." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. Mason's face changed slightly. Gareth went on. "I turned around anyway." "What happened?" "My team leader grabbed me." The sentence came out flatter than Gareth expected. Daniel came over the radio again. Gareth stopped. He could not hear the winds now. Only Daniel. Not as memory softened him, as he had actually sounded. Breathing hard, impatient, certain. "What did he say?" Mason asked. Gareth looked at him. "He told me to stop trying to make his decision for him." Mason did not move. Gareth almost wished he would. "He said the injured man was my responsibility now." A long silence followed. Then Mason asked, "Was that the last thing he said?" "No." "What was?" Gareth's eyes shifted toward the field watch on his wrist. He had worn a different strap then. Same scratched case, same hands, same habit of checking time even when time had stopped meaning anything useful. "He told me I had 4 minutes. Mason's expression tightened. "For what?" "To get the others clear." Gareth rubbed one thumb across the edge of the watch. "I used 3.
There was the number. The number he had punished himself with for 2 decades. 3 minutes. Enough time to believe one more minute could have changed everything. Mason seemed to understand before Gareth explained.
You thought you could have gone back in the 4th?
Yes.
Could you? Gareth did not answer immediately. This was the part he had avoided even with himself.
No. Mason blinked.
No?
No.
Gareth sat across from him. The route was already compromised. The second access point collapsed before we reached extraction. By the time we were clear, there was no route back. Mason stared at him. Then how was that your fault? Gareth gave a humorless smile. It wasn't hard to make it mine. That's not an answer. It was the answer I had. For 20 years? Yes. Mason pushed his chair back slightly. The scrape against the floor made Ranger raise his head. You knew he chose to stay. I knew. You knew he ordered you out. Yes. You knew you couldn't get back to him. Yes. Mason stood too quickly. Pain hit his knee and forced him to catch the edge of the table. Gareth moved instinctively. Mason raised one hand. Don't. Gareth stopped. The word carried more force than any shout.
Mason remained standing, weight on his good leg.
Do you understand how insane this sounds to me?
Gareth said nothing.
My mother spent years wondering what happened. Mason, no! Now the anger came. Not explosive. Clean. You don't get to explain it away yet. Gareth lowered his hands. Mason's face had gone red, partly from effort, partly from something that had waited much longer than Gareth had been in the room. She had one folded flag, Mason said. One letter. A handful of people saying they were sorry. Gareth looked at the floor. She thought he died in training. I know. No, you know that now. Mason pointed toward him. You knew the real version. Not all of it could be shared then. I'm not asking about classified details. His voice cracked slightly. I'm asking about who he was. That landed harder than accusation. Mason steadied himself against the table. You could have told her he stayed because somebody else needed to get out. Gareth swallowed. You could have told me he didn't panic. Silence. You could have told me he made a choice. Gareth looked up. Mason's eyes were wet but furious. I grew up thinking the biggest thing about my father was that he died. Gareth felt something in his chest give way. Mason continued. You knew something bigger. Gareth had no defense. There were reasons, classification, command instructions, his own collapse afterward, the way Daniel's family moved twice, the years passing faster once shame had learned how to disguise itself as respect. None of those reasons survived Mason's sentence. I was afraid, Gareth said. Mason laughed once. Of what? Your mother. That surprised him. Gareth continued before he could retreat. I was afraid she'd ask whether I could have saved him. Could you? No. Then why were you afraid? Because I thought she'd believe me. Mason went still. Gareth looked at his hands. And I didn't. The anger in Mason's face shifted, not gone, changed. Gareth spoke more quietly now. If she blamed me, I could live with that. If she forgave me, I didn't know what I was supposed to do with it. Mason stared at him for a long time. That was your choice. Yes. And you made it for all of us. Gareth nodded. Yes. There was no useful way to soften that. Ranger stood and crossed the room. For a moment, Gareth thought the dog would go to Mason. Instead, Ranger stopped between them and sat facing neither man, body angled toward the front door. Not comforting, not mediating, simply present.
Mason looked down at him. My dad liked dogs? The question came so abruptly, Gareth almost missed it. Yes. What kind? Any dog that ignored him. Mason's mouth twitched despite himself. Gareth remembered. He used to complain that friendly dogs had no standards. A small sound escaped Mason, not quite laughter, not forgiveness either. It was the first thing in the room that belonged to Daniel as a living man rather than a dead one. Mason sat again.
Tell me something else. Gareth looked at him. Not about how he died. The request changed everything. For nearly 20 years, Gareth had allowed Daniel's final minutes to consume the rest of him. Now Mason was asking for the part Gareth had helped erase. He hated powdered eggs, Gareth said. Mason frowned. What? Could smell them before he saw them. Said they tasted like warm insulation. Mason gave a short laugh. Gareth continued. He cheated at cards. He did not. He absolutely did. How? Badly? That got another laugh. Small, unwilling, human. Gareth leaned back. He carried cinnamon gum even though nobody else liked it. Could sleep sitting upright. Could not sleep on airplanes. Mason's expression softened. He snored? No, he talked. In his sleep? Constantly. What did he say? Mostly nonsense. Gareth paused. Once he spent 10 minutes arguing with someone named Ellen about a lawnmower. Mason stared at him. My grandmother's name was Ellen. Gareth stopped. Mason smiled for real this time. Only for a second. Then the smile faded. The loss underneath it remained. So he talked about home. Sometimes, but not me. Gareth did not lie. No. Mason looked toward the window. I was 4 when he died. That answered part of the question Gareth had carried since learning Mason existed. My parents weren't together long, Mason said. They split before I was born. Mom said he was trying to figure out how to be involved without making things worse. Gareth listened. He visited, not enough, but he did. Mason rubbed one hand over his face. Maybe he didn't know how to talk about it. Maybe. Don't make excuses for him. I wasn't. Good. Another silence. This one was different. Still painful. Less hostile. Mason looked at Gareth. You don't get to turn him into a saint either. I know. He left people behind too. Yes. He left me. Gareth nodded. Yes. Mason seemed relieved by the answer. Not because it hurt less, because Gareth had not tried to steal the right to be angry. Outside, a snowplow passed slowly along the street, amber lights flashing against the windows. The road was still closed. The storm was still there. Nothing practical had changed. Mason looked at Gareth's watch. 4 minutes. Gareth followed his gaze. Yes. You've been carrying that number all this time? Yes. Mason leaned back. My dad gave you 4 minutes to get people out. Yes. And you did. Yes. Mason looked toward Ranger, then back at Gareth. Maybe that's what he left you. Gareth frowned. What? People. The word sat between them, not forgiveness, not absolution, a possibility. Mason continued. Maybe he didn't leave you a debt. Gareth's throat tightened. Mason's face hardened again before the moment could become too easy. But you still should have called. Gareth nodded. I should have. My mom deserved that. She did. I deserved it. Yes. Mason looked at him steadily. And I'm still angry. You should be. The answer seemed to matter.
Mason reached for his coffee and realized again that it was cold. This time he pushed it away. "Make another pot." Gareth stood. "That in order?" "My father apparently liked giving those." Gareth looked at him. Mason did not smile, but neither did he look away. Gareth crossed to the counter and started the coffee. Behind him, Mason opened Wes Holbrook's notebook only far enough to move it aside. He did not return to the pipeline records, not yet. For the next hour, while the roads remained buried and the wind worked at the windows, Mason asked Gareth about Daniel Kerr. Not the mission, not the death. The man. And Gareth answered.
The first call came at 8:17 p.m. Mason's phone vibrated across the kitchen table hard enough to knock against Wes Holbrook's notebook. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. Gareth was standing at the stove, heating soup neither of them particularly wanted. Ranger lay near the front door, chin on his paws. Mason answered. "Kerr?" The voice on the other end was clipped and fast. Mason straightened. "What reading?" Gareth turned. Mason reached for a pen. "Say it again." He wrote a number on the back of an old grocery receipt. Then another. The color left his face. "Is that live?" He listened. "No, don't reset anything." Another pause. "Who's on duty?" Mason pushed himself up from the chair. His knee was still stiff, though he could put more weight on it now. "Call county response. Now!" He ended the call. Gareth did not ask whether something was wrong. That was obvious. "What happened?" Mason looked at the number he had written. "Control at the West Transfer Point is seeing repeated high-pressure alarms on the 6th branch." "The one in Wes's notebook?" "Yes." "Could it be the sensor?" "Could be." Mason reached for his work jacket. "But they've got 2 different points showing the same trend now." That changed things. Gareth shut off the stove. Outside, the storm had weakened, but the cold had become vicious. The temperature had dropped far below zero. Wind drove loose snow in thin sheets across the road, polishing old drifts into hard, pale curves. "What does that mean?" Gareth asked. "Demand went up when the temperature dropped." "Expected." "Yes." Mason pulled on his boots. "But if the regulator on L17 isn't moving correctly, pressure can build upstream." "Can?" "Yes." Not is. Mason looked at him. "Not yet." The distinction mattered. Neither man wanted fear making decisions faster than facts. Mason called the number for County Pipeline Emergency Response. This time he put the phone on speaker. A dispatcher took the equipment identifier, location, alarm readings, and the report number Mason had filed the day before. When Mason mentioned Wes's manual logs, the dispatcher paused. "We have that submission." "Then you know this isn't the first discrepancy." "We know it was flagged." "Can you get somebody out there?" "Crew is already being mobilized." Mason exhaled. Good. Not dramatic. Not satisfying, just good. The dispatcher continued. "County Road 9 is open to emergency vehicles only. Main west approach is drifting again. Stay off company property unless requested." Understood. Gareth looked at Mason. Mason looked back. For once, neither argued. They stayed where they were. For 23 minutes. Then the second call came. The county response coordinator introduced herself as Nora Bell. Her voice had the deliberate calm of someone who had learned that urgency worked better when it did not sound frightened. "We have a maintenance unit trying to reach the West regulator," she said. "Primary service route is blocked." Mason pulled the old pipeline map across the table. "Where are they?" "Near County 9 and the retired compressor access." "That route will drift shut." "We've figured that out." A faint edge of humor. Then business again. "Dispatcher says you worked that section." "I did." "You know another way in?" Mason glanced at Gareth.
Gareth had already understood. The service track from Wes's property, the one Ranger had followed. "There's an old inspection track from the Halbrook place," Mason said. "Not maintained." "Passable?" "Yesterday with four-wheel drive." "Yesterday wasn't tonight." "No." Nora paused. "We have one county utility truck with chains. I need someone who can identify the spur junction." Mason started to answer. Gareth spoke first. "I can." Mason looked at him. Nora asked, "Who is that?" "Gareth Vale." "You company?" "No." "County?" "No." Silence. "Then why do you know the route?" "Went through it yesterday." "That doesn't make you qualified to work the line." "I didn't say I was." Gareth's voice stayed even. "I can show your crew the road. Your people handle the equipment." That was apparently the right answer. Nora said, "Can you get to the West Fire Station?" Gareth looked out the window. "Give me 20 minutes." Mason reached for his coat. Gareth pointed at the knee. "No. Don't start. You're not climbing around out there. I'm the one who knows the equipment layout. You can explain it." "To who?" "Nora." Mason was already pulling on his gloves. "You know the service track. I know which valve they need." Gareth stared at him. Mason added, "And before you say anything, I'm not touching it." The argument ended there. Ranger stood. Both men looked at him. Mason frowned. "He stays." Ranger walked to the door. Gareth looked at the shepherd. "No." Ranger sat. Mason opened the door to test the wind. The dog stepped through before either man could stop him. Mason looked at Gareth. "Your dog." "He's not my dog." Ranger stood beside the pickup, waiting. Mason gave Gareth a tired look. Apparently nobody told him. The West Fire Station had been converted into a staging point. 3 county trucks idled beneath floodlights. Workers moved between them in heavy, insulated coveralls, faces mostly hidden behind balaclavas and hoods. Nora Bell stood beside a utility vehicle with a radio in one hand. She was in her mid-40s, compact and sharp-eyed, wearing an Orange County response parka over dark work clothes. Snow had frozen along the edge of her hood. She looked at Gareth once, then at Mason's limp, then at Ranger. "You brought a dog." "He brought himself," Gareth said. Nora stared at him for half a second. "Fine. Dog stays in the vehicle when we reach the line." Mason unfolded the pipeline map across the hood. "This is the regulator." Nora leaned closer. Mason traced the buried line. "Primary access comes from here. That's where your truck got stuck?" "Yes." "Then come from the north." He pointed toward Wes's property. "Old inspection track joins the pipeline about half a mile west of the valve station." One of the technicians stepped closer. His name patch read Ortega. He was broad, middle-aged, with ice crusting the shoulders of his blue insulated suit. "That track graded?" "No." "Bridges?" "One culvert." "Condition?" Mason glanced at Gareth. "Unknown tonight." Ortega nodded. At least nobody pretended otherwise. Nora folded the map. "We go slow." That became the plan. No speeches, no heroics, just a convoy of 3 vehicles leaving the fire station at 12 miles an hour. Visibility worsened outside town. Gareth drove first with Mason beside him. Nora's utility truck followed. The maintenance unit came last. Ranger stood braced in the rear seat, balancing easily as the pickup moved through uneven snow. Gareth reached County Road 9 and turned west. For a while, there were still plow markers, then only fence posts. Mason watched the GPS and the darkness beyond the glass. "You ever think this is strange?" "What?" "You knowing my father?" Me knowing the pipeline? Ranger knowing the road? Gareth kept both hands on the wheel. No. Mason looked at him. No? Strange is thinking any one of those things is enough. He slowed around a drift. Tonight works only if everybody knows one piece. Mason was quiet after that. At Wes Halbrook's driveway, they turned onto the inspection track. The snow was deeper than before. Gareth shifted lower. The pickup crawled forward. Once the rear tires slipped sideways. He corrected without oversteering. Behind them, the county truck held distance. Ranger began pacing across the back seat. "Sit," Gareth said. The dog ignored him, then stopped suddenly, head high. Mason looked back. "What?" Ranger stared through the left rear window. Nothing visible, only snow. Gareth continued another 30 yards. Ranger gave one sharp bark. Not loud, immediate. Then another. Mason twisted in his seat. "He didn't do that yesterday." Gareth slowed. The track ahead dipped slightly. At first the depression looked ordinary, snow settling unevenly around brush. Then the headlights shifted. The ground was wrong. A shallow sag ran across the shoulder near one of the yellow pipeline markers. Not a hole, not yet. A broad section of crusted snow had dropped several inches. Gareth stopped the truck. The convoy behind him stopped too. Nora's voice came over the radio. "Problem?" Gareth picked it up. "Possible ground depression left side of track. Can you confirm?" "No." Mason leaned toward the windshield. A thin patch of frost near the depression looked darker than the surrounding snow. He opened his door. Gareth caught his sleeve. "No! I need a better look." "No!" Mason pointed. "I'm not walking onto it." Nora approached from behind, accompanied by Ortega. Both stayed on the packed center of the track. Ranger remained inside the pickup, restless now, nose close to the window seam. Ortega crouched at a safe distance. He did not touch the ground. Instead, he removed a handheld gas detector from his outer pocket and extended the sensor forward. The device chirped, then accelerated. Ortega stood immediately. "Back up!" Nobody argued. "Back up, now!" They retreated 20 yards. Nora raised the radio. "Possible gas release near line marker 6L17 West. Establish exclusion." Mason's face tightened. So Wes was right. Gareth looked at him. "We know there's gas." "That's enough. It's enough to act. Not enough to explain everything, but enough." Nora directed one vehicle to remain behind as a warning point, while Gareth led the other truck around the depression, using a higher parallel section of old ranch track. Ranger's warning had not identified a leak. The detector had. The dog had noticed something different first. Smell, ground disturbance, or both. That distinction mattered to Gareth. Ranger was not magic. He was attentive. Sometimes attention was enough to keep a person from taking one more step. The auxiliary valve site appeared shortly before midnight. Low steel housings rose from the snow behind a chain-link enclosure. The maintenance technicians took over immediately. Gareth stopped at the gate. So did Mason. That boundary was deliberate. Ortega and 2 other technicians entered carrying instruments and insulated equipment cases. Radio traffic became more technical. Valve position, upstream pressure, downstream pressure, temperature compensation. Gareth understood almost none of it. Mason understood enough to look worried. "What?" "The regulator isn't responding the way they expect." "Meaning?" "Could be partially stuck." The radio crackled. Ortega requested authorization to isolate the branch. Nora relayed to regional control. For several minutes, nothing happened. That was the hardest part. Not running, not doing. Waiting for the people responsible to decide. Gareth had spent much of his life believing action was the purest form of usefulness. Age had taught him something less satisfying.
Sometimes usefulness meant staying out of the way of people who knew more than you did. Mason stood beside him in the wind. You hate this. What? Not being the one doing something? Gareth looked at him. You talk too much. Daniel do that? All the time. Mason almost smiled. The radio came alive again, authorization granted. The technicians began isolating the section. One valve responded. The second moved slowly. Pressure held, then began to fall. Not fast, steadily. Mason watched a portable display through the open rear of the utility truck. Come on. The number dropped again. Nora stood nearby, one hand pressed to her headset. Another reading came through, then another. Finally, she exhaled. Branch isolated. Nobody cheered. The technicians kept working. Ortega reported that the affected section would remain shut pending inspection and leak assessment. Regional control had begun rerouting supply. The town might see reduced gas pressure overnight, but there was no immediate, uncontrolled escalation. Gareth looked toward Timberline Falls in the distance. Only a faint orange glow showed beneath the clouds. No explosion, no fireball. No spectacular disaster narrowly outrun by one man. Just lights still on, where lights were supposed to be. Mason sank onto the edge of the pickup's passenger seat. His injured knee had finally had enough. Ranger climbed down and pressed against Mason's good leg. Nora walked over. You Kerr? Yes. I read the report you sent. Mason waited. The notebook helped. It was Wes Halbrook's. I know. Nora looked toward the isolated line. Those old readings got the control center to take tonight's discrepancies seriously, faster than they otherwise might have. Mason absorbed that. So the report mattered. It did. She glanced at Gareth. And the alternate route mattered. Then at Ranger. And apparently the dog has opinions about road conditions. For the first time that night, Gareth smiled. Barely. Nora continued. Don't turn any of that into a legend. Mason looked at her. What? This didn't work because one person saved anything. She pointed toward the technicians. Operator saw the alarms. Another direction. Dispatcher connected them to your report. Then toward Gareth's truck. You knew a route. She nodded at Mason. You knew the system. Finally, she looked toward the dark section of buried pipe. And somebody before all of us wrote down numbers when they didn't make sense. Wes. Nobody needed to say his name. Mason looked at Ranger. The shepherd was staring down the service road, still waiting, in some part of himself, for the man who had taught him that route. Gareth understood then what had actually changed. Warnings had existed before tonight. The line had spoken through numbers. Wes had written them down. Mason had reported them. Ranger had returned to the places where those warnings had been noticed. None of those things had been enough alone. Tonight, somebody finally listened to all of them together. The wind eased near 1 in the morning. The crews remained behind to secure the site. Gareth and Mason were released to return to town. On the drive back, Mason watched the distant lights through the passenger window. You think Daniel would have liked this? Gareth considered the question. Liked what? Nothing blowing up? Gareth laughed once. Daniel strongly preferred that. Mason nodded. A minute passed. Then he said, You were right. Gareth glanced at him. About what? Not going back to the station ourselves. Gareth faced the road again. Don't say that too often. Why? I'll become unbearable. Ranger settled across the rear seat. No one spoke for the next several miles. There was nothing left to prove that night. Behind them, professionals worked around an isolated section of pipeline.
Ahead, Timberline Falls remained quiet beneath the storm clouds. The town would wake knowing almost nothing about how close a bad system had come to becoming a worse one. Gareth was fine with that. Some victories did not need witnesses. They only needed people willing to notice a warning, pass it forward, and believe the next person might listen.
3 weeks after the line was isolated, Timberline Falls stopped talking about the storm. That was how towns survived things. First, there were emergency vehicles, road closures, rumors at the gas station, and people calling relatives to say everything was fine. Then came repairs. Then arguments about responsibility. Then groceries, school schedules, broken furnaces, and everything ordinary enough to push fear back into its proper size. The investigation into Line 6 L17 did not disappear as quickly. State inspectors recovered archived pressure data from systems Mason had never had access to. The manual readings in Wes Holbrook's notebook were compared against raw event histories, maintenance records, and internal summaries. The pattern became harder to explain away. Several high-pressure events had been reduced or removed from morning reports. Inspection recommendations had been delayed. A replacement request for the West regulator had been pushed into the next budget cycle, despite repeated warnings about its condition. The name attached to those decisions was not dramatic. Martin Sayer, Regional Operations Manager. No criminal mastermind, no secret saboteur, just a man who had repeatedly chosen cheaper numbers over inconvenient ones. According to the preliminary findings, Sayer had altered or approved changes to safety summaries in order to avoid a winter shutdown that would have triggered repair costs, contract penalties, and a costly interruption to regional supply. Gareth learned most of that from Mason. He did not attend the interviews. He did not sit in hearing rooms. He did not need to. The people responsible for investigating were finally doing their jobs. That was enough. What mattered more came on a gray Tuesday afternoon when Mason called him. They found Wes. Gareth stood outside his cabin, stacking split pine beneath the porch roof. For a moment, he did not understand the words. Alive? Alive. The piece of wood in Gareth's hand dropped onto the pile. Where? Hospital in Rock Springs. How? Car accident. Mason paused. Apparently he was trying to get the records to a state field office. Gareth leaned against the porch post. He made it? Not where he was going. Mason's voice softened. Truck went off the road during freezing rain. He was unconscious for 2 days. No wallet when they brought him in. Phone was destroyed. And nobody connected the name? Hospital had him under the wrong spelling until yesterday. Gareth closed his eyes. A week of absence, a company saying Wes had quit, a dog left waiting. All of it suddenly became smaller and sadder than conspiracy. You told Ranger? Mason laughed quietly. I'm pretty sure he doesn't understand phone updates. Gareth looked toward the dog. Ranger lay near the woodpile, chin lifted, watching him. Maybe more than we think. They drove to Rock Springs the next morning. Mason's knee had nearly healed. Gareth barely noticed the limp anymore unless the ground was uneven. Ranger stood in the back of the pickup for most of the trip, shifting his weight with every turn. The broken chain was long gone. His collar had been cleaned, but the leather still carried the deep wear marks of years. Mason rested an elbow against the window. You nervous? Gareth glanced at him. About Wes? No. Then what? Mason looked toward the back seat. The dog. Gareth understood. For the first time since the night at Pumping Station 6, Ranger was going somewhere Gareth knew the dog actually belonged. There was relief in that. And something else Gareth did not bother naming. They found Wes in a rehabilitation wing on the second floor. He was thinner than Gareth expected. 58, broad-faced,
with gray blonde hair thinning over a high forehead and a neatly trimmed mustache and chin beard. His left arm was supported in a sling, and bruising still colored one side of his jaw. He was arguing with a physical therapist when they arrived. "I can walk to the bathroom." "You can fall to the bathroom, too." "I've been walking 58 years. And yet gravity remains undefeated." Mason stopped in the doorway. "Sounds like him." Wes turned. For 1 second, his expression stayed annoyed. Then he saw Ranger. Everything changed. The shepherd froze, not cautiously, completely. His right ear stood rigid, the left angled outward. Wes said one word. "Ranger." The dog crossed the room so fast the leash slipped through Mason's hand. Ranger reached the bed and stopped short rather than jumping. His entire body trembled. Wes leaned forward, ignoring the sling, and pressed his good hand against the dog's neck. "Hey, old man." Ranger pushed his muzzle beneath Wes's arm. A sound came from him that Gareth had never heard before. Not a bark, not a whine exactly. Something low and broken with relief. Wes closed his eyes. "You stayed?" Ranger pressed closer. "Of course you stayed." Gareth looked away. There were reunions a stranger had no right to watch too closely. Mason seemed to feel the same. They stood near the door until Wes finally looked up. "You're Kerr." Mason nodded. "Yeah. Night maintenance." "You remember?" "I remember everybody who stole my batteries." "They were communal. They were mine." Mason smiled. Then Wes looked at Gareth. "And you?" "Gareth Vale." Wes's eyes narrowed slightly. "You the one who found him?" "Ranger found me." That made Wes smile. "Sounds right." Wes scratched the dog behind the ear. "I tied him outside the maintenance shed before I left. Thought I'd be back before dark." His voice changed. "I was taking copies of the logs to the state office. Didn't trust email anymore." "What happened?" Mason asked. "Black ice. Went off the road east of Wamsutter." Wes shook his head. "After that, mostly ceiling tiles and people asking me my birthday." He looked at Ranger again. "I figured somebody would take him home." Mason glanced at Gareth. "He disagreed." Wes nodded slowly. "I imagine he did." There were questions about the records, about Sayer, about how long Wes had suspected the summaries were being changed, but none of them felt urgent in that room. The dog had found his person. For Gareth, that was enough for one day. When they left, Ranger did not follow. Gareth reached the hallway and stopped. The absence beside his leg felt immediate. Mason noticed. "You okay?" "Why wouldn't I be? You've asked that question enough times that I know what it means." Gareth looked back through the doorway. Ranger had settled beside Wes's bed, head on the mattress, home in the only way that mattered. "He was never mine," Gareth said. Mason nodded. "No." The word did not hurt as much as Gareth expected. Then Mason added, "Doesn't mean he didn't bring you somewhere." Gareth looked at him. Mason started down the hallway. Gareth followed. The investigation concluded 2 months later. Sayer was fired. Regulators required a broader inspection of the regional system. Several deferred maintenance items were moved forward. Wes gave testimony from home. Mason kept his job, though not under the same supervisor. He told Gareth that part almost casually. Then spring arrived. Snow withdrew from the lower hills. Mud replaced ice along the roads. The cabin roof began dripping every afternoon. Gareth returned to routine. Wood, repairs, coffee, silence. Except the silence was different now. It no longer felt like something he was defending. One Saturday morning, a truck came up the gravel road. Mason stepped out carrying a cardboard box. No crutches, no work jacket. Just jeans, a charcoal Henley, and an old denim coat Gareth had never seen before. "What's that?" Gareth asked. Mason lifted the box.
My mother's attic. That sounds dangerous. It was.
Gareth opened the cabin door. Mason came in. The box went onto the kitchen table. For a while, neither man touched it. Then Mason removed the lid. Inside were old envelopes, folded papers, photographs, a set of dog tags, and a handful of items so ordinary that Gareth felt less prepared for them than he would have for anything military. A motel key card, a baseball ticket, a receipt from a diner in Virginia. Mason picked up a photograph. "Recognize this?" He handed it across the table. Gareth did immediately. Daniel stood on the left. Younger than Gareth remembered himself being, hair cut short, one hand holding a paper cup. The expression on Daniel's face was somewhere between amusement and irritation. Gareth stood beside him, no beard, less gray, less weight behind the eyes. Another man had apparently said something just before the picture was taken because Gareth was looking away from the camera. Daniel was looking directly into it. Alive. Gareth sat down. Where did she get this? No idea. Mason pulled out another, then another. Some Gareth had seen before, others he had forgotten existed. One showed Daniel asleep against a wall with his mouth open. Mason laughed. "So you weren't lying about that?" "I never said he looked dignified." Another showed Daniel beside a rental car with one boot on the bumper. Another, Gareth and Daniel standing under a cheap motel awning in heavy rain. Mason watched Gareth's face as much as the pictures. "He had a brother." Gareth looked up. Mason tapped the photograph. "Not by blood." Gareth said nothing. "But he had one." The word should have comforted him. Instead, it hurt. Mason seemed to see that. "I'm not saying you replace him." Gareth frowned. "Replace who?" "My dad." Mason sat across from him. "I don't need another father." The sentence was direct, but not cruel. "I had one, complicated as he was." Gareth nodded. Mason continued, "And I'm not your responsibility because he died." Something in Gareth tightened. Mason saw that too. "That's the part you need to hear." Gareth looked down at the photograph. "You don't owe him your life." Mason leaned forward slightly. "And you don't owe me one either." The room was quiet. Gareth's field watch ticked softly against his wrist. He had spent years believing survival created obligations that could never be completed. Daniel died, therefore Gareth had to carry Daniel. Daniel had a son. Therefore Gareth had to somehow become useful enough to justify finding him late. The logic had always sounded honorable when he kept it inside himself. Spoken aloud, it sounded like another way of refusing to live freely. "What do you want from me?" Gareth asked. Mason looked at the box. "This." "What?" "The stories." Gareth waited. "I want to know why he hated powdered eggs." A small smile. "I want to know why he had a motel key from Norfolk in a box for 20 years. Gareth looked at the key. "That one has a story." "I figured." "He got locked out wearing nothing but gym shorts." Mason's eyebrows rose. "Now we're getting somewhere." Gareth laughed. It surprised him, not because it was loud, because it did not hurt afterward. Mason picked up the photograph of Daniel asleep. "Tell me about this one." Gareth studied it. For years, every story about Daniel had eventually bent toward the same ending. The last mission, the radio, 4 minutes. The place Gareth could not return to. He looked at Daniel's sleeping face in the photograph, then at Mason. "This was Georgia." "When?" Summer. Gareth leaned back. Hot enough to make everybody hate each other. Mason smiled. What happened? Gareth began. Daniel had lost a bet. That was how the story started. Not with a mission, not with death.
A stupid bet involving a vending machine, 3 quarters, and a jar of mustard someone should never have bought. Halfway through telling it, Gareth realized he had stopped checking how the memory ended. Daniel was simply there, complaining, laughing, cheating, alive inside a story that did not require punishment. Outside, the wind moved softly through the pines. The cabin door stood open to the spring air. There was no dog asleep beside it anymore. Ranger belonged somewhere else. That was right. Gareth looked at Mason across the table. Daniel belonged somewhere else too. Not in the ground. Not in the 4 minutes Gareth had carried for 20 years. Here. In the ridiculous photograph. In Mason's questions. In stories Gareth had almost allowed himself to forget. Mason turned over another picture. What about this one? Gareth smiled. That one's worse. Good. And Gareth told him, sometimes healing does not mean leaving the past behind. It means learning to carry it differently. Gareth spent years turning Daniel's memory into a punishment, until a dog, a son, and a truth he had avoided showed him that love was never meant to become a life sentence. In our own lives, there may be people we miss, words we never said, or mistakes we still replay. But peace can begin when we stop asking the past to condemn us and allow it to teach us how to live with more courage, honesty, and grace. If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories of loyalty, healing, and second chances. May you find peace with what you cannot change and strength for what is still yours to live.